Hello, I'm Emily and I'm an educator at MOHAI, and this is Collection Connections Objects in Question, where we take a quick peek into Seattle history by taking a really close look at one item in our teaching collection to see what it can tell us about the past. Today, we're going to be exploring the Great Seattle Fire, and this is our object. But first, let's have a think. So when I think of the Great Seattle Fire, the very first thing that I think of is the fire theater here on the second floor of MOHAI in our True Northwest galleries. It is an amazing musical experience where the artifacts sing to you and tell you all about the Great Seattle Fire. And because I've seen and heard this theater so many times, I know that the date of the Great Seattle Fire is June 6, 1889. Now, some of the details of the Great Seattle Fire are fuzzy or debatable, but we do know some things about why this fire was so disastrous and so great. One thing is that the buildings in Seattle were mostly made of wood and they were kind of close together. And this fire also started in a woodworking shop. So there were lots of shavings and wood pieces and lots of fuel for the fire in this woodworking shop. And it started because somebody was heating a pot of glue over a fire and it started to overheat and explode everywhere. And it was poorly dealt with, and this just caused the fire to spread throughout the shop into the rest of the building and the building next door. And other things in Seattle were made of wood too. So the sidewalks were made of wood, the pipes, the water pipes were made of wood, and they were pretty small. So not only was the pressure not very good, but then these pipes burnt as well as the fire spread. The fire chief was out of town. Not very good for fighting this fire. And then also when the firefighters did arrive, they were plugging in so many hoses that the water pressure fell drastically. And then, one of their backup options was to pump water out of Elliott Bay, but the tide was really far out, so the hoses didn't really quite reach the fires as well. And when I think of the Great Seattle Fire, I also think about the rebuilding process and how it happened really, really quickly. And I think about how, because of this fire, people decided that they wanted to do some fire safety and prevention measures when rebuilding, like making buildings out of brick and making the streets wider and starting a professional fire department instead of a volunteer fire department, and creating a new municipal water system. So because of the fire theater, those are all the things that I think about when I think about the Great Seattle Fire. What do you think about when you think about the Great Seattle Fire, or when you think about firefighters past and present? This is the object we'll be exploring today. Our first step is to use our senses to make as many observations as possible. Starting with the material, the very first thing that I notice is the main material of the object. So it's kind of hard and smooth, but flexible, and black on the outside. But then when we take a look on the inside, it's got this natural brown shape and it's a little bit softer. It feels like leather. And I also noticed that there are these metal rings that are attaching the side of the container to this strap right here. And I also noticed that there's some string that is sewing all of the different pieces of leather together, both at the bottom, the top, and this strap. And then as far as condition goes, there's some cracking in the leather. The inside is really dirty. So it definitely looks old, but it's still in solid shape. And then the other thing that I noticed is this image on the front. So it looks like it's been painted on, and it's mostly white, yellow, green, and red. There's this flower decal down at the bottom that's got some red, gold, white, and yellow. And then this thing here looks like a machine of some kind. It's got wheels that probably turn. It's got this exhaust pipe thing up top that's red with some smoke coming out of it. And then there's this kind of decorative, maybe functional thing here at the front that's green and kind of fun looking. Kind of looking at my first observations and starting to put things together, it seems like it's a bucket. So it's got a container and it's got a strap. So this tells me bucket. Because we're thinking about firefighters, I'm thinking that this is a bucket for a firefighter, maybe for tools, and that this thing here is also something to do with firefighting. Because it has wheels, I'm thinking maybe it's a vehicle of some kind. And yeah, those are some great observations for this object. Look at that. So in this photograph, we've got a picture of people standing in a line in front of a wooden building, and along the top it says Firemen's Headquarters. So these are firefighters, and we actually see 3 of the same machine behind them that we see painted on the front of this bucket. And if we look at the leftmost one over here, we can see that there is a hose attached to this machine. So that gives us a really big clue that this has to do with water and hoses. And that's because this is a steam engine pump. So the boiler in the steam engine creates steam, and that powers the water pump. So firefighters would bring these engines over to a hydrant usually, and they would pump water onto the fire that they're fighting using these steam engines. Now, this gives us a clue as to kind of what this bucket has to do with as well, because it connects it to water, which is really interesting. So this is a water bucket. Another way that firefighters at the time would fight fires is by using what's called a bucket brigade. And that's when people would fill buckets with water and they would pass them from person to person down a line of firefighters in order to pour the water onto the fire or send it back down the line in order to refill the water from a source. What does this tell us about the Great Seattle Fire or firefighting at the time in 1889? One thing that I think it tells us is this bucket is pretty small. It doesn't hold a lot of water. So if you're using a bucket brigade, you definitely would want multiple buckets and lots of people getting some water from these buckets. I think it also gives us a clue that sometimes fighting fires wasn't always the easiest thing to do given the technology that you had, and so you might want to have multiple ways to fight the fire. That's a really cool object. I'm still really curious about how a steam engine works, and I'm definitely really curious to learn more about kind of the safety measures and improvements to the city that were made in rebuilding after the Great Seattle Fire. What questions do you have? You can explore some of your history questions by visiting the MOHAI website. That's mohai.org, mohai.org. And you can also email us at education@mohai.org to request any future Collection Connections, Objects and Questions videos. And thanks for watching.